and welcome to Spotlights, a podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this episode, I'm going to kind of remix some of our previous episodes. Since we have over 40 episodes, we really built up a lot of content in this past year, 2020, 2021, and I figured it'd be good to shine a new light on that material so that if you have seen these episodes, the remix will maybe show that there's been some common themes that have occurred throughout them. And if you haven't been keeping up with these episodes, hopefully this is a nice introduction to some of the material that has gone on. And if you're more interested in checking it out later, you can find the links for their full episodes at the information for this one. So what the topic will be about for this week is climate change. We've had a lot of guests on the show who have addressed the religious dimensions of climate change. And in particular, this week, I want to share some clips from a few people who are discussing some books that have come out. So first, I'll have Andreas Karelas talk to us about his book, which is called Climate Courage: How Tackling Climate Change Can Build Community, Transform the Economy, and Bridge the Political Divide in America. And he'll talk a little bit about his experience of the intersection of religion and climate change. And then we'll pass it off to David Haberman, professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Indiana University Bloomington, and he'll talk about his new book, which is called Understanding Climate Change Through Religious Lifeworlds. Following David Haberman, I'll pass it off to Robin Veldman, and Robin's book is called The Gospel of Climate Skepticism: Why Evangelical Christians Oppose Action on Climate Change. So hopefully these three perspectives give you a sense of all the ways that you can understand the intersection of religion and climate change. And I'll pass it off to Andreas first. But in what you're looking at, you found a really positive role for religion for this climate courage.
Absolutely. And it's been a really bright spot in the climate movement for me, seeing all the incredible work that's been done by faith communities. And actually Catherine Hayhoe's research, really helped me kind of see what was happening here, is that actually there are certain folks in that will use their religion as a way of really aligning with their political views and saying, so for example, one of the things that Catherine points out that I mentioned in the book is that if you look at a list of the religions in America and where they rank in terms of their belief on climate change, Catholics of Hispanic descent are the number one most concerned. And that makes sense because the Pope came out with the encyclical on climate change, which I write about in the book, his encyclical on climate change and injustice. And that makes sense. Here's the Pope. This is a big issue. It's, there's an encyclical about it. We've got to take this seriously. And you go through all the religions, and all the way on the bottom are Catholics or white Catholics. Same religion, same good book, same Pope, right? First and last, right? And so at that point you realize that there is a lot of politics involved in religion. There is a lot of people sort of maybe dismissing or interpreting their faith in a certain way based on their political views. And so, but when you look at religions, you see across the board that there is almost in all the wisdom traditions, there is some connection to the earth. There's some connection to having harmony with nature. There is some connection of stewardship, right? This sense of we have to sort of take care of the garden. And you actually, and one of the things I point to in the book is that there are a number of really interesting movements happening. So I talk about Interfaith Power and Light, and their ability, they've brought together, tens of thousands of congregations around the country of all different faiths to take action on climate change. You have Green the Church, which is working with African-American churches around the country. You have Green Muslims, which is in Wisconsin, working with Islamic faith groups. And so, you really, and also you also see evangelical groups, right? You have a number of evangelical groups that have taken a strong stance on climate change. And I think we should all be supporting that and embracing that and saying, yes, this is a moral question, and we are at a time where we need faith communities to step up. The same way, during the civil rights movement, right? Martin Luther King, obviously, letter from a Birmingham jail was speaking to people of clergy and saying, I need people of faith to step up and recognize the urgency of the moment. And I think that we're seeing that happening in the climate movement, and we need more of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the analogy with the civil rights movement is a really strong one. And then, part of the issue is that there's kind of like another force in religion that isn't being paid attention to that much. And it's the way in which people have a kind of religious or spiritual connection to like consumerism or capitalism. And people forget, like, if we want to complain about the religions that are really holding us back, it might be that people have something like a religious level of devotion to overconsumption, right? In the way that like Black Friday is like a national holiday, right? And so I really appreciate that you bring up the kind of psycho-spiritual dynamics of that in the book as well. So what did you kind of find looking at the, not just the economic side of consumption and capitalism, but this kind of psychological and spiritual side as well?
Yeah, this is a topic that, in my opinion, is really at the crux of the climate crisis. I open up a chapter with a quote from Gus Speth, former dean at the Yale School of Forestry, and he basically says, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says, if people were really happy in the current sort of consumptive world that we have, then it would be hard to make a change. It would be hard to change the way things are. But if what we have is a spiritual hunger in the age of plenty, right, then you actually have a real opportunity for change. And I think that's so poignant. I think that we as a society are unhappy. We're unhappy, and there are plenty of signs you can look at, across the board. We have, in fact, the unhappiness levels are so high that we now have an entire field of study called diseases of despair, right? So you have depression, suicide, addiction, right? Use of antidepressants. All these things are and of course it's tied to the highest rates of income inequality in over 100 years, right? So and of course the political divide is also a representation of that, right? We're more divided now than ever. All of these things are tied in some ways, not exclusively, but in some ways, to our isolation, our increasing consumption of media, and sort of being kind of stuck inside our own worlds, kind of stuck in front of a screen, which of course is even more so now that we're all at home during the pandemic. And so what we're lacking are the things that give us more, what the psychology shows is that what actually makes us happy is connection to other people, community, loving relationships, feeling that we have a purpose, feeling that we're giving back, and sort of being of service, and less so much concern about myself and my things and my money. And so I think we need a real shift. Again, Martin Luther King, we need to shift from a person-oriented, we need to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. And so that to me is profound, because when it comes to climate, if we think about what's causing climate change, it's humanity using up the resources that we have on this planet at an accelerating rate and producing this, sort of catastrophe in its wake. And that drive for consuming more is really a spiritual hunger that we're trying to fill, right? But it can never be filled with the material consumerism. It can never be filled. And so we could have all the planets, a sort of infinity, right? That we're consuming the resources of, and we'll never feel happy. And so we actually need to shift sort of our perspectives. And so what I kind of bucket it in a chapter called simplicity, a sort of gratitude, simplicity, and service, because I think these are and I tie a number of ideas into that. But I think if we as Americans we in the Western world can focus more on being grateful for the incredible quality of life that we have, and we simplify our life, focusing more of our attention on our relationships, on experiences, on self-care and our spiritual practice or our mindful practice or prayer, whatever that might be, our creative pursuits, and then choosing to give back, right? Be of service to others. That psychological research shows these are the things that are going to make us happier, right? These are the things that are going to make us feel more fulfilled, and thus, sort of damper our need for ever more consumption.
All right. Big thanks to Andreas Karelas for sharing his perspective with us. Now I'm going to pass it off to David Haberman to talk about his new anthology, Understanding Climate Change Through Religious Lifeworlds.
I've only been able to physically hold a copy of Understanding Climate Change Through Religious Lifeworlds since the very beginning of this month. So I guess I received copies last week. This book is the culmination of several year research project that was initiated by the Center for Study of Latin American at American University. And it was, I think, a 3-year research project funded by a loose grant. And it involved a group of international scholars. And this is actually just one of 2 volumes that are coming out of that work. This is the first one, which is the anthropological case studies. But Evan Berry is editing a second volume that's going to look more at policy, policy changes, and religion. But the project focused primarily looking at glacier deterioration and related floods and storms that are happening increasingly in high mountainous areas, focusing particularly on the Andes in Peru and the Himalaya in India, and also looking at small island vulnerability in the face of climate change in the Caribbean and South Pacific. So that's kind of the range, and there's more involved in that. But the question is, what is happening with religion and climate change these days? And I think this is a growing field of study that many do see as an outgrowth of the field of religion and ecology. But some have suggested that because it's just such an overreaching concept effect that perhaps it's beginning to find a place of its own. But in many ways, it's a project that is arguing that in considering climate change issues, religion matters. Religion is something that really has a great deal to contribute to that. So in the ethnographic case studies, we're looking not only at how religions are responding to climate change related challenges. And there's the question, is climate change a singularity? And when we look at different cultural understandings of climate change, the answer in many ways, I think, to that question is no, that climate change itself is being interpreted through particular cultural lenses. And that means that any attempt at adaptation and mitigation are going to be conceived of in different ways in different parts of the world. And if we as a globe are going to be able to address and somehow effectively deal with climate change, we have to take those extremely local understandings of what climate change is very seriously. And it's also looking then at how climate change is affecting religious communities, both at the level of theological conceptions. We're seeing significant changes in religion due to climate change related challenges. as well as changes in ritual practices, the way those are thought about, and community formation. So religion is affecting people's understandings of climate change, and climate change is affecting religious transformations around the world today. I think those are, just in a general sense, the kind of issues that we're interested in. And it's also, again, just finding a more solid place at the table in global climate change discourse for religion. Scientists who are involved in studying climate change identify drivers of climate change. So we know burning of fossil fuels, et cetera, are labeled as major drivers of climate change. But what I think that many involved in the kind of project that manifests in a book like Understanding Climate Change through Religious Lifeworlds would argue that there are other major drivers of climate change, such as conceptions of self and worldviews, understanding of the nature of the world, and particularly the more than human world. Those are major drivers in climate change that are not really recognized in a lot of contemporary climate change discourse. Yeah, so I think it's looking at those kinds of issues generally.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks to David Haberman. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Robin Veldman to talk about her research into evangelical Christian perspectives on climate change.
I think that the dynamics are changing within evangelicalism. And so, given that evolution really came to a head in like the 1920s, like the debate within evangelical Christian circles, and climate change within the 2010s, and now coronavirus, obviously. I think I was just reading somebody, a evangelical reporter who worked for the Christian Post, which is a pretty important evangelical newspaper, and he was saying that he doesn't feel that there's even a mainstream of evangelicalism anymore. I think it's like, I think that the way that information circulates through the community has really changed so much, especially in the digital age, and the proliferation of online misinformation. Right. This is something I'm trying to really understand better right now. Like, I don't have a fully accurate view of it, but I just, my time in the field really made me understand or come to the conclusion that at least within evangelicals, media is an important source of way in which they come to a particular understanding of contemporary issues. And so I've definitely seen similar things going on with coronavirus, like the main climate skeptic organization. I just looked back recently. The first email that climate skeptic organization, the Cornwall Alliance, sent out on like March 13th, 2020, said there will be at most 37,000 deaths in the United States, and that's even beyond imagination and probably totally exaggerated. So, and he even, the E. Calvin Beisner, who's the head of the Cornwall Alliance, even explicitly said, if you know our views, you won't be surprised to read this because it's the same thing we say about climate change. Like, right. So, like, I think the underlying thing there, the commonality seems to be opposition to like government intervention of any form. And I tend to not see it as anti-science in a broad brush because there's so many scientific issues that evangelicals do accept. It's just a few here and there, that they have problems with. So yeah, I see it more sociologically as like a sense of, as I talk about in the book, like embattlement with secular culture that's driving it, rather than like, oh, I just don't like science.
Right. That seems like a good point. Sometimes you hear these kind of people making snappy comebacks like, oh, well, if you don't believe in climate science, then how do you believe in the science that makes your computer work? And it's like, no, they're not just against all science. And you're like, what about 2 + 2 = 4? They're like, no, that's fine. We're not against all math and science or any kind of knowledge. And yeah, it makes sense that the government intervention would be the thing. And they're just like, no, this one feels like it's getting too much in our world. And obviously, right, if climate change is real, then that would justify the government doing all kinds of things to cut emissions, and that's going to affect our jobs and our communities. Would you say that was also the issue with evolution, that the concern was also there might be some government overreach, or there might be somehow some political control, that was
It's
a
interesting. That's
concern?
a good question. Like, I do think that's one of the ones where things have changed a lot, just because that was like a century ago. Um, a study that's really good by Elaine Howard Eklund and some of her colleagues, she's a sociologist at Rice, found that when you do kind of a correlation between religion and climate attitudes and religion and evolution attitudes, that religion for evangelicals pretty much explains attitudes towards evolution, but it is not as it's correlated at a much lower level for climate change. And the way I interpret that is not that religion is irrelevant with climate change, but that's become very inextricably entangled with politics in a way that's hard to measure via a survey, but I do think that the fight over evolution started this, and also over, higher criticism of the Bible. Like, there's that whole history of how evangelicals divided from their, mainline and progressive brethren in terms of how the Bible should be interpreted. And that started creating a cleavage within evangelicalism, between evangelicals and like the world, or the sort of the mainstream world. And so I think it set in motion, what would eventually come to pass with climate attitudes. But I think there are different factors specific to those eras that were driving it.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? The politics are changing, and then also the way the communities themselves are changing, and then adding on digital communication more recently. And one of the things I often wonder is, where's the unity of the evangelical community, right? Is there any hub where they all can get on the same page, in the way that Patriarch Bartholomew for the Orthodox, or Pope Francis for Catholics? In some cases, would that explain why there's so much variability between different evangelical communities?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Everybody takes the Roman Catholic Church as kind of the counterexample to evangelicalism because it's so hierarchical.
Yeah.
Even there, though, it's interesting how, with like Laudato Si and Pope Francis, like, it's not like everyone just fell in line. So,
That's true.
authority is a tricky thing. It doesn't really, it's not like anyone's a dictator.
Yeah.
It doesn't translate as much as you might think it would. But yeah, within evangelicalism, it's super decentralized. There is no one recognized leader. People build their authority by developing popular ministries. And oftentimes they do that through, if somebody has a successful church, they get a bigger church. They might then start, airing on the radio or airing on television, like Jerry Falwell did in the 1980s. And then a bunch of people followed in his wake. And so that's one of the reasons media has ended up being incredibly powerful within the evangelical community as a way of agenda setting. Because there's no centralized authority. So it's really based on like kind of charisma and your ability to like attract a following. And so that also puts evangelical leaders in this tricky position where they can be replaced if they're not, if they're saying something super controversial or trying to push people a little too much, like people might just decide to go elsewhere. And I think right now what we're seeing, in 2021 is this tension between evangelicalism as a political identity and evangelicalism as a theological or religious identity. And Catherine Hayhoe, who's an evangelical climate activist, like way better known than me, or I guess I'm not an activist, but like she has talked about this distinction as being really important. And so there are people who go to evangelical churches, or even who may not go to church but identify as evangelical because of what they associate it with. And it's kind of that group that is probably the most likely to be skeptical of climate change. I would say, rather than if you just do evangelicalism by theology and you include evangelicals of color, then you're going to see a much less strong association. So really, one of the fascinating things with evangelicalism is it depends so much how you measure who an evangelical is.
Right.
And I think most people just have no idea that that's the case. And I never did, reading the newspaper for all those years thinking I knew who evangelicals were. And then I like started doing research and was like, wait, which denominations are evangelical again? And you have to, I'm like pulling up my charts and tables and trying to figure out, how do you know these are evangelical? Like, it's just really complicated.
That's a really funny problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I actually recently realized I have a colleague who's does a survey with the it's called National Surveys on Energy and Environment. And they had some really cool data looking at evangelicals, comparing white evangelicals to evangelicals of color. And there's really a remarkable and consistent difference between those two groups. So that, just points in the direction of, it's not just theology, it's like interpretive communities. So I feel like even more convinced of that conclusion than when I finished the book.
Yeah, that's always nice, right? The more data keeps coming out, you're like, yeah, I thought so.
I mean, I'm sure some things will be wrong.
Yeah, that's true. I guess you always want that to some extent. That's how we keep furthering the research. You got to find, some cracks in it somewhere. What do you think is explaining the difference between white evangelicals and evangelicals that are, communities of color? What's going on there where people of color are more willing to accept climate science and things like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been looking for research on that and have not found as much as I would like to find, at least on kind of like an ethnographic level, because that's what I really understand. Like you can see it in the survey data, but I don't understand from kind of a first person perspective why that difference exists. And I mean, there's I know that Amanda Bao, who may have been on your program, she has been working with Latinx Catholics, so not evangelicals, but in the LA area, and they're much more concerned about climate change and environmental issues, but in a way that often is like, just doesn't fit into the normative view of what counts as environmentalism. So she has had some really interesting research there. Yeah, other than that, like there's the reality that people of color get hit harder and will be hit harder by climate change. There's also probably the reality that they're less likely to be embedded in like media environments that are so consistently skeptical.
Right.
And then they also haven't been targeted the way white evangelicals were. And so white evangelicals are kind of, were there was some pretty consistent messaging going out in Christian radio from the period I looked at was 2008 to 2015 that was just kind of like pushing this climate skeptical narrative. But I mean, evangelical mass media is kind of what unites evangelicalism, but it's always been very much uniting a white evangelicalism. So I'm really wondering, the extent to which evangelicals of color may not be as compelled by James Dobson or some of the other big players in evangelical mass media, and maybe that has an effect.
Oh, that's super interesting.
More research.
All right, thanks so much to Robin Veldman and to David Haberman and Andreas Karelas. I hope you enjoyed hearing about their books, and if you haven't seen those episodes, I hope that you go check out the full episodes. And if you have seen them, I hope you enjoyed this little remix of some of their content. So we'll be back next week with more content for you. In the meantime, take care and be well.